Let's turn our attention back now to the Skills and Jobs Summit. With me is the new chair of the Standing Committee on Economics in the Federal Parliament, Daniel Mulino. Daniel, thanks very much for your time. You've been involved in these roundtables on the Skills Summit. What's the key issue that you've picked up that needs to be addressed?
Well, thanks very much for having me on, Kieran. And actually, I've just come here today from a significant event at the William Angliss Institute, where we had many people from right across the skills ecosystem, if you will. We had trainers, we had a whole range of people who provide training services and understand the skill needs. What we're seeing right across the economy, of course, is a huge skills shortage. And so the Skills Summit next week, I think, is going to be absolutely critical to putting some ideas onto the table for trying to work through this stage of the economic cycle. My sense is that it's going to require pulling all of the economic levers. We're going to need to make sure that our skills system is able to train people up for emerging jobs better. We're going to need better data as to where those emerging jobs are arising, and that's why the creation of Jobs and Skills Australia was so critical, and one of the first bills of this government, in fact. And it will require other levers as well, such as increases in skilled migration over time.
So over time, it's interesting you raise that, because Matt Keane, the New South Wales Treasurer, today, front page of The Australian, urging the federal government to get on with stamping passports of skilled workers. He's even talking about a new low-skilled worker visa. What do you make of that? How important is that migration piece, not just in the longer term, but in the short term as well, to fill these gaps?
Well, look, for me, the first priority needs to be to get our skills sector training people for jobs that are there. And if you look at my electorate, I was on a tour of the Victoria University campus in St Albans last week with the Minister for Skills, Brendan O'Connor. And we toured a facility that was actually slated to be closed a decade ago and is now absolutely thriving. It's providing Cert 3 and Cert 4 courses in cybersecurity, VU, operating in tandem with Cisco. It's a remarkable place where we're seeing kids, often from quite disadvantaged backgrounds, receiving training in an area where there are massive amounts of jobs. And one of the students, a very charismatic young man, had a long discussion with the Minister and myself around the fact that he was receiving remarkable training that inspired him and was in an area that he was very interested in. But he was also talking about the fact that he'd been on a lot of jobs websites and seen that there were more than 500 jobs available in the area that he was being trained in. So, look, we do need to have a discussion around skilled migration, and our economy has been affected by the shutting down of skilled migration for a couple of years or more as a result of COVID. But look, the first priority, I think, needs to be we've got to train people, especially our young kids and especially those from electorates like mine, for jobs that are there.
And one of the issues is knowing, as you said, where the gaps need to be filled. Today, the government releasing a list of the top 10 areas where there are shortages. Not really rocket science, is it, in that sense? We know where the workers are needed. And when you go through the list from the top down, civil engineers, nurses in aged care, nurses across the board, we know where these gaps are.
Look, I think you're right. We know at a high level, but I think there can often be quite a degree of difficulty in knowing at the more granular level. And when you look at a lot of what employers actually want, and, I've had some discussion over the years with, private companies like LinkedIn and Seek and others. They talk about the fact that often what employers want are a very specific set of qualifications, or indeed a very specific set of skills. So often it takes very granular data to understand the dynamics of the labour market. Often it takes a really detailed understanding of what are the skills that people in a certain community have and what is it precisely that employers want. And it's only when you get that level of detail that you want, that I believe that you can get the matching working as efficiently as possible. And the other dimension is that quite often what you see in the labour market is that you need to have an understanding of where the medium and long-term needs are arising. And that requires very complicated forecasting. So again, to go to your point, look, we do know that we're going to need more nurses. We do know that the services sector and the care economy as a whole is going to grow. But in terms of forecasting that very accurately down to specific qualifications and down to more granular subsets of skills, that actually takes a great deal of skill. And so I think government investing more in data is actually very important.
Okay. Yeah, and as you said, that's where the Jobs and Skills Australia will be able to at least feel part of that response. I want to ask you about your book. It's a substantial piece of work, Safety Net, the Future of Welfare in Australia. And you've argued that it's instructive to think of the welfare state as a vast social insurance scheme. We all benefit from this insurance scheme. Can you explain that for our viewers, your argument on that?
Yeah, so look, I think it's important to look at where the welfare state came from. I think it's one of the crowning achievements of public policy ever, certainly in the last couple of 100 years. It really came from insurance schemes. If you look back to Bismarck's Germany in the 1880s, if you look at Franklin Roosevelt's Second New Deal, if you look at a lot of our schemes, the age pension in 1908, the reforms of Curtin in World War II, they were insurance schemes that government was strengthening through reforms that mandated participation or subsidised participation. And so the welfare state has always been about risk management for individuals. And if you look at one of the issues that's coming up for the Jobs Summit, how do we deal with issues like unemployment, long-term unemployment? How do we deal with preparing people for the future? Sometimes I think the debate in the last 20 or 30 years has focused too much on how do we structure payments so that people aren't lazy? How do we structure payments so that people aren't too picky when it comes to looking for jobs or don't stay too long out of employment? But I think a much better framework for thinking about it is how do we invest in people? How do we look at people and what they might need invested in them to switch to new careers? A risk management framework, I think, takes you to looking at the kinds of disadvantage that people can take when things don't go right, when maybe the skill set that they have isn't as needed in the economy, and what's it going to take to get them back on a better path. I think it's a much more constructive way to think about what we need our welfare state to do for people.
And do you think that those departments involved in delivering the support are nimble enough? Is there capacity to do what you're saying, to be able to be as individual, to tailor the response to individual needs as much as you argue in the book?
Well, look, I think you're right. I mean, it's an ongoing challenge. It's a work in progress. I certainly, in my book, am at pains to say the welfare state is now so big and so complicated. There's no silver bullet. But I think if you look at the overall trend in policy over the last 20 or 30 years, both here and abroad, I think there are many areas of the welfare state where risk management has been coming more to the fore. So the NDIS is a good example. It was a scheme that was built around insurance principles and also built around giving more agency to people with long-term needs and building their benefits around long-term investments in those people. So I think that's one example. I think Jobs and Skills Australia is another example where we're going out of our way right at the start of this government to invest more in bringing all the stakeholders together and investing in better data collection. So these are all steps on a journey. It's a very, very complicated set of institutions that we're dealing with. So there's no simple way to move government service delivery down the path of more individualised service delivery, but it's certainly where we should be headed.
And as finally, Bill Kelty describes your argument as seeing welfare not as charity, but as an investment in our society.
No, exactly. And for me, this is one of the most important things, that there is an important redistributive element of the welfare state. And one example of that for me is the fact that it's funded from progressive taxes. Those who are better off, I do believe, should fund the welfare state in a proportionately greater manner. But I do think it's a mistake to look at the welfare state as lifters and leaners, as Joe Hockey did, for example, in the past government, or in the US, some people talk about it as makers and takers. When you look at the welfare state, the two biggest areas of expenditure by far are the health system and the retirement income system. And in both of those systems, we all take part in those parts of the welfare state. Moreover, when you look at people's life journeys, most of us at some points in our life, whether it be through bad luck or just the life cycle, end up receiving different benefits at different points. So I think it's much healthier to think of the welfare system as something that we're all in together, that is managing risks for us, rather than something that is them and us.
Daniel Mulino, Chair of the Parliamentary Economics Committee, thanks for your time. I appreciate it.
Oh, thanks very much, Kieran.